What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to some more tips and tricks for the EOS R5. This time around, I'm looking at multiple exposure functionality that's built into the camera and what you can do with it. As with many features on the EOS R5, most of what I'm going to cover here also applies to the EOS R6, and in this case, the R, as well as many other EOS cameras such as the 5D Mark IV. Of course, as usual, some details will vary from camera to camera, so check your manual for your specific model. One big caveat to all of this is the new EOS R3. There appears to be some significant changes to the multiple exposure system on that camera, at least based on what I've read in the manual. As a result, the overall workflow should be the same, as should some of basically the feature settings, but many of the details, such as supported file formats and shutter modes, are different. Since I don't have an EOS R3, I can't speak to the specifics of that camera. To my mind, at least, there are two major applications for multiple exposure shooting. First is creatively superimposing images. Of course, this can also be done with much more control in software like Photoshop in post-processing. The other use is to stack and average images to create effectively a longer exposure, in effect, mimicking the use of a neutral density filter. This is something that I find very useful to have in camera, as it significantly saves on storage space and post-processing work. So with the introductions out of the way, let's dive right into the features on the camera. Multiple exposure shooting on the R5 and most other Canon cameras that include the feature is available when the camera is set to RAW, CRAW, or JPEG image formats. However, it's not available when using dual pixel RAW or when shooting with the fully electronic shutter. R3 may be different. Moreover, all of the images are saved in the format that you have the camera configured for. So if you're shooting CRAWs, then the multiple exposure file will also be a CRAW. If you're shooting in JPEG, then the multiple exposure file will be a JPEG. R5 and R6 users will find multiple exposure settings on the Shoot 5 menu page in photography mode. Entering the multiple exposure menu presents you with a host of options for configuring multiple exposure shooting. The first option is multiple exposures, and this controls not only whether the multiple exposure mode is enabled, but which of two ways it will work. The options here are disabled, which obviously turns off multiple exposure functionality, on function control, which allows you to control the multiple exposure operation for each frame, and on continuous shooting, which optimizes the multiple exposure shooting system for continuous shooting instead of for frame level control. Which of the two options you want to use obviously depends on how you're using the multiple exposure functionality. If you're creatively blending images together, you'll probably want to use the function control setting, as it superimposes the current multiple exposure image over the live view so you can see how things are going to line up and stack, and also allows you to undo and retake each of the stacked images as you go. On the other hand, if you're using a multiple exposure system to simulate neutral density effects, then shooting in continuous mode is preferable to minimize frame-to-frame delay. The second option in the menu is multiple exposure control, though a better heading for this might be blending mode, as it controls how the exposures are combined. There are 4 options here, and those are additive, average, bright, and dark. Additive simply adds to each image cumulatively, so to compensate for the exposures adding, you'll need to manually set exposure compensation for the number of shots that you're combining. You'll need to set -1 EV of exposure compensation for a 2-frame stack, -1.5 for a 3-frame stack, -2 for a 4-frame stack, and so on to -3 for an 8-frame stack. Of course, if you're shooting with third stop exposure steps, half stops are slightly problematic. For 5 and 7 frame stacks, you'll have to find something that works in your situation, as neither -2.3 or -2.7 EV, respectively, are quite right. Personally, I've never bothered all that much with additive, though it does purport to do the least amount of manipulation to your data. The next setting is average, and according to the manual's description, this applies negative exposure compensation automatically. Additionally, the manual claims that if you shoot multiple exposures of the same scene, the subject's background will be controlled automatically to obtain a standard exposure. In practice, what I've seen is that it simply averages the frames together. I've never seen any subject detection, any processing other than averaging, or any adjustments to the backgrounds or anything else to get a standard exposure. And quite honestly, I'm not sure why the manual is so obtuse here either. To me, it feels like something either was lost in translation somewhere, or someone couldn't just write averages frames together, or something equally simple like that because it didn't sound like it was complicated enough for a manual explanation. In any event, this is what I use when I'm shooting in multiple exposure mode 99+% of the time. The final two options are bright and dark. These do the same things, but at different ends of the brightness range. When the camera is set to bright, the camera will keep the brightest pixel value for each pixel of all the exposures in your set. Dark does the same, but only for the darkest pixel value. I find these are most useful for creative effects, as bright and dark will mask, for lack of a better term, your subjects from black or white backgrounds respectively. Moving along the menu, the next setting is number of exposures, and this controls how many exposures the multiple exposure system will shoot and combine. This can be set from between 2 and 9 exposures. When shooting in average mode to simulate the neutral density effects, this setting effectively sets how much neutral density will be simulated. 2 exposures translates to 1 stop, 4 exposures to 2, and 8 exposures to 3. The odd number out, 9, allows you to stack an entirely previously shot set of images with up to 8 additional images. So again, in the neutral density context, you could shoot a stack of 8 frames, or 3 stops, of the simulated neutral density, then set that image as the starting point for a 9-image stack to end up with a total of 16 total images, or 4 stops of neutral density style averaging. For bright and dark blending modes, you'll probably only ever use 2 to 4 exposures, though if you're shooting in function control mode, you can set this higher than you actually need, as that mode allows you to end the multi-exposure process early and save your results at that time. Of course, you can repeat this process of blending 9 frames into a new image, and then using that as the source of the next image indefinitely, or at least until you run out of storage space on your memory card. Continuing down the options, next is Save Source Images. There are 2 options here, which are All Images and Results Only. All Images saves all the images you take, while Results Only saves only the final blended image. That said, one of the reasons I tend to make a big deal out of in-camera averaging / synthetic neutral density is because it saves storage space and post-processing work. And it does that because you can tell the camera to save only the resulting image file. So for example, if you're shooting 8-frame groups to say average together, and you're shooting in RAW, this will take up about 360 megabytes or more of storage space on your card for the source images that you want to stack and average in post, or just saving the source images. However, if you compare that to the result-only mode, where you end up with only a single 45-ish megabyte RAW, that's already average, stacked, and ready to go. So, as I said, personally, I almost always have this set to results only, but again, that's because most of my use for the multiple exposure mode is to simulate or extend neutral density filters. However, if you're using this for creative superimposition effects, then I would recommend keeping the source images, as you have much more control over the complex blending of your images in post-processing software like Photoshop than you do in camera. If you don't like the in-camera result, you can fix it up in Photoshop in post. The final setting is Continue Multiple Exposures. This sets whether the camera will continue or automatically disable the multiple exposure shooting at the end of the sequence. As far as recommendations go, this one setting is definitely situational. Obviously, if you're doing a lot of, say, neutral density type stuff or a lot of creative superimposition stuff, leaving this at continuous means that you don't have to keep going into the menu to keep changing the setting or keep re-enabling multiple exposures from frame to frame. Last but not least, we come to the bottom of the menu page and the Select Image for Multiple Exposures button. This allows you to pick a starting image from your card so that for the multiple exposure set. Remember, this image does count as one of the exposures in the set. Of course, this can be used for a number of creative effects. For example, you could use a picture of water or fabric or a textured wall as the first image and then superimpose your other images over that. Of course, the same rules apply with respect to blending modes light, dark, and additive when doing this. Alternatively, if you're using the multiple exposure process to simulate neutral density with the average mode, then you can use this to start with an existing stack and to continue extending it, as I noted earlier. If you've selected an image and you want to cancel that selection, you can use the Deselect Image button that appears at the very bottom of the menu when an image is selected. With all that said, there are a couple of caveats to what images you can select. First off, the image has to be the same size as the images you're trying to shoot. That is, if you're in full frame mode, you can only use full frame images saved on your card. Likewise, if you're shooting in 1.6 crop mode or with an EFS lens, you can only select images that were shot in 1.6 crop mode. That said, it doesn't matter if the crop was set manually or if it was set automatically as a result of using an EFS lens. Second, for the R5, R6, and earlier EOS Rs, and Canon DSLRs with the multiple exposure functionality, you can only select raw images to use as the first frame. However, if you're using an EOS R3, you can only select JPEGs as the first frame. Ultimately, the multiple exposure process also comes with a handful of caveats and things that are just good to know anyway. So, to start with, most camera settings such as ISO, picture style, high ISO noise reduction, color space, and so on will be set by the first exposure. This includes when that exposure was loaded from the card. So if you select an image that was shot at ISO 102,400, the camera will switch to 102,400 ISO, and that's what you will shoot all of the rest of the images in your multiple exposure stack at. However, you can change the shutter speed and aperture as you're shooting. Second, if you use the auto picture style, when in multiple exposure mode, the camera will always select the standard picture style and not one that might be more appropriate for your subject matter. Third, aside from setting multiple exposures to disabled in the menu, turning off the camera, including auto power off, switching into auto plus, a custom shooting mode, so that would be C1, 2, or C3, or into movie mode will cancel and disable multiple exposure shooting. So with most of the details out of the way, let's briefly look at the two shooting modes, continuous and function control shooting. Though it's out of order compared to the menu, I'm going to start with continuous shooting as it's a little bit simpler. The continuous shooting mode is primarily intended to get you through a set of images as quickly as possible. Only limited control over exposure settings between each frame is available. You can change the shutter speed, aperture, or exposure compensation, but that's kind of about it. However, you can't review the exposures you've taken or the progress of the multiple exposure image as a whole while you're shooting it. Personally, I use this mode most of the time when I'm shooting as it minimizes the frame-to-frame delay, and that's preferable when simulating neutral density effects. However, for creative shooting, you'll probably want to use function control shooting. When shooting in this mode, a few added features are enabled. To start with, the multiple exposure image as it currently stands is superimposed over your live view of the scene. Additionally, you can review your progress between shots, you can undo the last image you shot, and you can prematurely end your multiple exposure settings with saving the results or discarding it. So let's look at a quick demo of function control shooting mode. For complete disclosure here, the demo you're seeing was shot on a 5D Mark IV since I already had it set up for shooting these videos, but the interface is exactly the same as it is on the R5. So let's start by enable multiple exposure shooting and function control mode. And since I'm shooting on a black background for this demo, I'm going to use the light blending mode or light exposure mode for multiple exposure control. Once that's all set up, I can make the first exposure. When the exposure is made during the normal review period, you'll have access to extended multiple exposure options by pressing the Erase Image button as indicated on the screen. The camera will automatically return to shooting after the image review timer expires. You can, of course, change the image review timer on the image review setting on the Shoot 7 menu page to extend it if you need to. One thing to remember is that for the last image in the multiple exposure sequence, when the image review times out, the camera will automatically blend the multiple exposure and you won't be able to make any changes. As I said, you can of course extend that time or the review time by extending the image review timeout, or you can hit the Erase Image button to bring up the multiple exposure control menu during that image review time and it will pause the process. Additionally, while shooting a multiple exposure sequence and prior to shooting the last image, if you miss the image review and you want to make an adjustment, such as deleting the last image or canceling the sequence, you can bring that back up by using the image playback button on the back of the camera. With the two images shot that I was going to do for this demonstration, the camera will combine them into a single file. So that about wraps up multiple exposure shooting functionality available on the EOS R5 and R6. If you found this interesting or informative, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. Remember, you can't forget to unsubscribe later if you don't remember to subscribe now. Finally, if you know someone else who might find this useful, help them and me out by sharing it with them. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.